Hello and welcome back to another marker video. Today we are testing out not one but two markers, the Arrtx Simptap acrylic paint markers and then their alcohol brush tip markers. Now I've seen this brand of acrylic markers all over TikTok actually, and I've been wanting to try them myself, so thank you so much to Arrtx for sending these to me. So the alcohol markers come in the cutest packaging. I love how cute the design on the box is, and I really like the actual markers. The barrel feels like a really nice quality material, and the brush tip is actually really nice. Not too soft and not too firm, and they do come with a swatch sheet, which is always really nice. But since I am going to be working on my usual toned tan paper, I went ahead and swatched them on that instead. I did also start swatching the acrylic markers on the same paper, which took forever, which I expected. These particular acrylic markers are their new Simptap markers, which I believe is the same formula as their other acrylic markers, the difference being the valve at the top that you push down to release the paint. With paint pens, I'm always worried about spilling or leaking, so I love that the tops come with these little caps to keep them from being pushed unintentionally. But of course it did take absolutely forever to get the ink for all of these pens flowing. But look at how satisfying that coverage is. Now, because this did take me so long, I did not bother filming it because I didn't want to bore you with the process. But that's all of the colors swatched. It does come with a pretty wide variety of colors, and I'm very grateful for that. However, I don't really get to take advantage of that with this drawing, so I'll have to play around with these markers a little bit more. Now, onto the art. It is at this point that I'm feeling really pumped about this drawing because I loved how the sketch turned out, and I was so stoked to color it, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I really hope I don't f this up. So out of fear of messing it up, I did do some testing and swatching on a separate piece of paper. You'll probably notice that this is a very Valentine's Day themed piece, and that's because this video was supposed to be up 2 weeks ago, before Valentine's Day. The reason it's going up now is because I did, in fact, fuck up the first drawing, and I decided to redo the entire thing. Things started out fine for the most part, but I just kept making mistake after mistake with this drawing. The first thing I noticed when coloring the hair was that these markers bleed a lot more than I'm used to, and I'm like, okay, no problem, I can account for the extra bleeding and I'll just be careful from here on out. But as we will find out later, I was not careful enough. And unfortunately that becomes a lot more evident as I'm coloring the skin because I'm working from dark to light, which involves a lot of layering. So you're starting with the darkest color, and on top of that you layer a slightly lighter color and all the way until you get to your lightest color. And this puts a lot of ink on the page, and with markers that bleed, obviously this is really going to push the color outside of your lines. But I did also notice with these markers that if you layer too many colors over the first color that you laid down, it does kind of turn a little bit patchy and it doesn't really react super well, which is common in a lot of alcohol markers. They're meant to blend well, but sometimes if you overwork the ink, it can just end up looking splotchy. And featured here is mistake number 2, the unintentional ink splatter. At this point I'm thinking, no problem, this happens all the time, and while its continued existence will annoy me for the duration of this drawing, I will find a way to fix it when I get to the background. This has happened countless times, you know, with drawings in the past, and there are always ways around it, but little did I know, this wasn't going anywhere. So here you can kind of see what I mean with the bleeding, especially with the skin as I'm blending the colors and laying down a lot more ink than I did with the hair. It's pushing the ink outside of the sketch lines, so the lines are kind of looking a bit fuzzy and like feathery, but that's okay because I am going to be going over the drawing with a pen later, and I will go ahead and thicken up the lines and hopefully be able to remedy that. Now listen, when I tell you I fought with myself throughout this entire drawing, I really kept thinking, trust the process, you can turn this around, and I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I will just say that you can't trust the process your way through everything. So here come the paint pens, and with them, mistake number 3. All I'm doing is filling in the clothes and adding a really simple heart pattern, so this should be super easy, which means I absolutely do find a way to f it up. Now, I'm editing this footage 2 weeks later, so I truly have no clue what was going on in my head when I decided to add a second layer of paint. I knew from swatching and testing the pens that this paper, while it is my favorite, is not the best for water-based anything. And I'm gonna let you guess what acrylic pens are made with. Water. Yeah. So imagine my absolute shock and horror when the second layer just ate up and buckled the paper. Wow, I could not have possibly seen that coming. Could I have used literally any other paper more compatible with acrylic paint pens? Yes. But I refuse to be blinded by the vast white nothingness that is any multimedia paper. I will remain loyal to my toned tan paper. Luckily, the damage to the paper was not as severe as the blow to my mental state, so I just kept pushing through. So I do just want to add a small disclaimer here. I did use an Ohuhu marker for the background. I wanted a very specific color for the background that the Arrtx marker set did not come with, and the paper that I'm using, obviously, isn't suitable for such a large surface area of acrylic paint, so Ohuhu pen. And it is at this point that past me assumed I would magically fix the random ink splatter by coloring over the background, which of course did not fix the problem because these are alcohol markers, not paint markers, so they blend, they do not cover. So for some reason, I wanted to see what would happen if I used a colorless blender on the spot after I colored around it. Yeah, I truly don't know what I expected out of this, so now the spot is larger and more noticeable. And at this point I'm really questioning whether I have learned anything in my lifetime as an artist. I don't even know what number mistake we're at, but yeah, this is another mistake. Now when I went to grab another paint pen to do the little heart pattern over her clothes, I did notice that I had to kind of refresh the paint pen to get the color to be accurate. It seems that if you let the paint pen sit for a while, the colors can kind of separate, so the pink was looking a little bit more yellow than it should have. I don't have a lot of experience with paint pens, so I'm sure this is normal, but just something to note. Oh, and here's another mistake that I made. I like to add highlights with colored pencils over my marker, and in like most cases it works out fine, but sometimes I get a little too cocky and I add a little bit too much, and then it ruins the entire thing. We can call this mistake number whatever. I did start out pretty light-handed at first, so it looked fine in the beginning, but I just added a little bit too much to the face, and sometimes the texture of the pencil just doesn't really sit right on the marker, and so it just kind of ends up looking a little bit too harsh. And on top of that, I probably should have chosen a slightly darker color to blend a little bit better, but I didn't, and that was just one of the many mistakes that I made. So here's another example of the paint pens kind of separating, so it's almost like a two-tone pen. You can kind of see like a darker purple and then like a lighter shade, so I kind of had to refresh it. So I would say just be sure that you shake them up a little bit before each use. So you know that part in the drawing process where you just finish adding the final details and you sit back and you start looking at the drawing as a whole? Yeah, you know how that's usually a really satisfying moment? Not this time. I just did not feel proud of this drawing at all, and I loved this sketch, so I just had such high hopes for it. But I just had to come to terms with the fact that this drawing just didn't pan out. Okay, so it's time for a quick intermission. After coming to terms with my failure, I realized I needed to do some more testing. I also kind of just wanted to compare the marker performance to my other alcohol markers. So I grabbed the most similar colors I could find between the Arrtx marker, my Copics, and my Ohuhus. I wanted to find out just how much the marker would bleed in comparison to the other two so I could get a better sense of where they sat on the scale and hopefully be more prepared for my redemption arc. Now you can definitely see that there's a bit more of a feathery or blurred edge when compared to the two other markers, and altogether I'd say Copic bleeds the least and Arrtx bleeds the most, with Ohuhu sitting somewhere in the middle, but the comparison did kind of help me get a visual as to just how much bleeding was happening and how much space I needed to account for. So here starts my second attempt. Here we are 2 weeks later with a newfound determination to redeem my past self. So I knew I really liked the vision that I had for the first drawing, which to me meant that I shouldn't change too much this time around. And for that reason, I made minimal adjustments to the color palette and focused on how I could just avoid the mistakes that I made the first time around. One of the things that I wanted to change was the color combination that I used for the skin tone. I did some more testing and found that one of the midtones that I chose just wasn't really playing well with the rest of the colors, and I think that's what really bothered me with the first drawing. It was just too gray, so I swapped it out for something close but a little bit more saturated with warmer undertones, and I do think that helped a lot. I also changed the order of the colors that I was using, so in the first drawing I went from dark to light, and in this drawing I worked from light to dark. And I do find that that helped a little bit with the outcome because I wasn't layering as many light colors over the top of the darkest color, so it wasn't turning nearly as patchy as the first one. But I did actually find that the bleeding was worse on this one just because I wasn't really focusing on that enough. So I wasn't being careful enough around the edges, but luckily the bleeding with these markers is so like light and feathery that it actually was really easy to fix when I started laying down like the background color. And also I just made sure this time around not to spill any ink droplets anywhere, because if I did I probably would have just given up on this video altogether. Okay. So now that I've talked your ears off about the endless amount of user error throughout this video, I'll talk about the pros and cons of the markers, which is what you're here for. So the one good thing about f***ing up as much as I did with this drawing is that me and these markers had the chance to get really comfortable with each other. For that reason, I do feel qualified to tell you the following thoughts. So let's go ahead and start with the alcohol markers. Pros. I love the packaging. The barrel just feels like a really nice quality material and it's really comfortable to hold, in my opinion. I also really love the brush tips. If you know me, you know I'm really picky about the material of marker brush tips. I like that these are flexible without sacrificing control. They're just stiff enough to be that perfect amount of firmness, in my opinion, while still covering a decent amount of paper in a short amount of time. I can't speak on durability since I've only had these a few weeks, but we'll see how they hold up to the abuse when I inevitably ruin countless more drawings. As for the cons, I would say these markers do bleed significantly, but this isn't really a deal breaker in my opinion. All markers bleed to some extent, and as long as you're comfortable with alcohol markers and you take the time to get to know these markers specifically, you can absolutely work around that. I have plenty of markers that I love that bleed, I just work around it by leaving space wherever necessary. My only other qualm with these markers is some splotchiness with blending. I did notice that layering a lot of ink on top of another color didn't necessarily blend the colors, so the more I layered, the more I noticed some patchiness. But that's also pretty common with most alcohol-based markers. I think that's just something that I'll have to experiment with more. So moving on to the acrylic markers, the pros. I would say the brush tips for these are the biggest pro. I really loved the material, and same with the alcohol markers, they were the perfect amount of like firm and flexible. The second pro would be the colors themselves. I'm not sure what other sets these markers come in or if they're sold individually, but I like the color combination that this box came with. I felt like it was a wide enough variety while also offering like a few similar colors that would work well together. I would also add that even after 2 weeks of sitting around on my desk and on my floor, these markers never spilled. I don't have a lot of experience with acrylic markers, as I mentioned, so I'm not sure how often leaking happens, but I was really happy that none of these made a mess. A con, in my opinion, would be the packaging for these. The box is really cute, but the actual colors and material of the barrels aren't my favorite, and some of the caps don't click on all the way, but this is more of a cosmetic complaint considering all the markers functioned properly. One other small con is the way the markers had to be swatched and sort of refreshed a bunch after sitting, since the colors were coming out funky. I would guess that this is a totally normal acrylic marker thing, but again, I don't use them often enough to know, so I'm sure I will find out as I use these more. So I just wanted to point that out, but after shaking them up again and getting the ink flowing properly, they worked like normal, so not really the biggest issue. Oh, I did like the opacity. I feel like they layered over things well enough and covered them, so that's also something to note. But comparing the two drawings, I will say that while I do like the outcome of the second drawing a lot more than the first drawing, I'm kind of surprised that I actually like the first drawing now. I don't know if I have spent enough time looking at the new drawing and comparing it to the first one, but I don't feel as disappointed with the first drawing as I did when I drew it. There are certain things about both drawings that I really like. One thing about the new drawing that I like is that I kind of wanted to add a little bit more visual interest, so I outlined her with my white Jelly Roll pen, and I do think that gave the drawing a little bit more of a finished feel. So that's obviously a big difference. I could have done that to the first drawing, but it's just something that I like about the second drawing. Obviously, learning from my mistakes, things were a lot smoother, the blending was smoother, the paint ended up looking better and I didn't layer quite as much. But I will say my one regret with the new drawing is that I wish I had gone darker with the skin tone. I like how dark the skin tone was in the first drawing, and I actually like the way that I blended things in the first drawing better. It was just the way that I blended them that made them turn out a little bit patchy, unfortunately. So I liked, for example, I liked the blending on the arm and the chest a lot more than I did with the new drawing. I think I got a little bit scared with the new drawing and I just didn't add as much depth and shading as I really wanted to. So that's one downside. But overall, I like the face more because the blending didn't end up as patchy and I didn't add too much colored pencil. So both drawings have their good and their bad. But let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know if you think the first drawing was a fail or just not my best. Obviously, the first drawing wasn't the worst thing that I ever created, but it definitely wasn't my best piece. And I am proud of myself for pushing through and finishing it anyway, and then admitting to myself that I wasn't proud of it and I wanted to do it again. I'm glad that I did it again. I think I learned a lot. I obviously learned a lot about these markers, and I will be using them again, and I learned a lot about myself and my process, and I'm happy. So thank you guys so much for sticking around through this whole roller coaster of a video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye!